Proposition 1, constitutional right to reproductive freedom. This is a legislative constitutional amendment. What that means is when the legislature wants to amend the California Constitution, somebody proposes an amendment, and then the state assembly and the state senate vote on that amendment. If it gets a 2/3 majority in both houses, then in the next election is placed on the ballot for the California voters to vote on. So in this particular case, this proposed amendment that I'll describe in a second did in fact pass the California State Legislature. It passed in June 20th. The California State Senate voted on this amendment, and then on June 27th, the California State Assembly voted on it. If you look at the table on your screen, on the left-hand side, you can see that it passed in the state Senate 29-8 with 3 people not voting. So every Democrat voted in favor of it. Every Republican who voted voted against it. And Scott Wilk, who's the representative for Senate District 21, was among the Republicans who voted no. On the right-hand table, you can see the vote in the state Senate. It passed the state Senate by 58-17. In that case, just of the people who voted, all 57 Democrats voted in favor of it. None of them opposed it. One Republican voted for it and all others voted no. The one Republican who voted for it was in fact Susan Valladares, who represents Assembly District 23, Santa Clarita Valley. She voted yes on it. But since it received the requisite 2/3 votes in both chambers, that's why we're voting on it now. A yes vote on Proposition 1 would amend the California Constitution to establish a constitutional right to reproductive freedom. Reproductive freedom in California law is the right to an abortion with some restrictions and the right to access contraceptives. A no vote wouldn't make abortions illegal in California. A no vote would simply mean that reproductive freedom would continue to be protected by state law. So let me give you some background. In June of 2020, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. In doing so, what they said is that the United States Constitution did not protect the right to access to abortions. They didn't make abortions illegal. Instead, what that ruling did is it said individual states have the right to determine whether to allow, limit, or ban abortions within their state. Now, this isn't as widely known, but the court case that protected a woman's access to abortions also dealt with contraceptives. So the effect of overturning Roe v. Wade was also to say that individual states have the right to determine whether to allow, limit, or ban the sale of contraceptives within that state as well. Now, the California Constitution guarantees everyone the right to privacy, but it doesn't explicitly define what this right includes. The California Supreme Court in different court cases has found that it does include the right to make reproductive choices, such as whether or not to have an abortion or whether or not to use contraceptives. State law, however, explicitly protects those rights with some restrictions. So what state law does now is it limits access to abortions once a fetus achieves viability. And I typically don't like to quote language from the law because it's kind of complicated, but I think in this case it's important to be clear. According to the Reproductive Privacy Act of 2002, viability refers to, quote, the point in a pregnancy when, in the good faith medical judgment of a physician, there is a reasonable likelihood of the fetus's sustained survival outside the uterus without the application of extraordinary medical measures. So that's what they mean by viability. Viability is that a fetus could live outside the mom. It also states, state law also states that the state may not deny or interfere with a woman's right to choose or obtain an abortion prior to viability of the fetus, or when the abortion is necessary to protect the life or health of the mother. So that's important to keep that in mind, and we'll discuss that in a second. In terms of the fiscal effect, According to the Legislative Analyst's Office, Proposition 1 would change the California Constitution to expressly include existing rights to reproductive freedom. Because these rights already exist in California, they're protected by state law, the proposition would have no direct fiscal effect. Here's the argument in favor of Proposition 1. Although reproductive freedom is already protected by California laws, Proposition 1 would ensure that access to abortions and contraceptives are protected from attack by a future California Supreme Court or legislature. If a future legislature wanted to limit or rescind existing reproductive freedoms, it would take a constitutional amendment requiring a 2/3 vote of the legislature to place it on the ballot and would then require the support of a majority of voters. Proposition 1 will essentially subject any effort to restrict reproductive freedoms to the most stringent level of constitutional review. The best way to guarantee that reproductive freedoms in California are protected is to give them the status as a constitutional right in California rather than just protections under state law. The argument in opposition to Proposition 1 is as follows. The goal of Proposition 1 is to energize voters who disagree with the Supreme Court's decisions to overturn Roe v. Wade. California state law already protects the women's access to abortions and contraceptives. The United States Supreme Court's ruling didn't change that fact. Overturning Roe v. Wade didn't change that fact. So Proposition 1 is not needed to protect a woman's health or their reproductive rights. California law already does this. We should not permit political parties or special interest groups to use the ballot as a way of energizing their voters. So once again, by way of summary, Proposition 1, if it passed, would amend the California Constitution to establish a constitutional right to reproductive freedom. That's right to an abortion with some restrictions, right, viability, a right to access to contraceptives. Yes would make reproductive freedom a constitutionally protected right rather than protected by state law. A no vote would mean that reproductive freedom would be protected by state law, but it wouldn't be a constitutional right. When I did my analysis of the different positions, the California Republican Party recommends a no vote. The California Democratic Party recommends a yes vote. The California Chamber of Commerce didn't take a position on this. The California Labor Federation recommends a yes vote. The Los Angeles Times recommends a yes vote. And the last time I checked, the Los Angeles Daily News did not make a recommendation on this. Thank you very much for listening.